Hello, welcome back to another episode of the It Starts With You podcast. This is like take 6. Normally I can just hop on and I just start recording these, but today, I don't know, it's just words. But here today, we're going to talk about boundaries. And why I want to talk about boundaries is because this topic actually came up at an event I was speaking at last week. So last week, I was speaking at a corporate office, a large corporate office here in the Milwaukee area in the financial services space. And I was leading a session in their Leading Others track. And so, those who were in my session, we were doing a session on strategic leadership essentials. And the people who were in the room, the majority of them, run their own business, their own practice, as well as they are in a leadership role where they are growing a team and they're trying to help and develop these people to grow their practices and their businesses while also really helping them to develop in their leadership role. And so the session that we were talking about was really, part of it was time management and how do we get more effective and efficient with our time. And then part of it was kind of this leadership framework that we were talking about, some of the essentials. And this idea of boundaries came up in our conversation and also was one of the takeaways that multiple people mentioned at the end. And then I was out for a walk this morning and I was thinking about some of the discussion and some of the things that came up. And I was like, this is a topic that we need to talk about on the podcast. So, first of all, when it comes to boundaries, and obviously we can set boundaries in all different areas of our lives, our personal life, our professional life. And a lot of people have a hard time setting boundaries on their time because they feel bad, they feel guilty. And I do see this a lot from a leadership perspective. So I'm going to start with that perspective in kind of this professional space. So in our conversation, we were talking about first the time management piece. And one of the things that I was sharing with those who were in the group and in the room was around not building on a rocky foundation. And what I find is people who are growing businesses or even growing in their leadership role are oftentimes trying to grow built on a rocky foundation, meaning we are building on honestly bad personal habits and now we're trying to add on people to our team or more responsibilities, or we're trying to help people with the things that we're struggling with ourselves. And then we don't have this really solid foundation. So sometimes what we need to do is we need to hold up a mirror, which is another phrase that really stood out to the attendees at this event, was we need to hold up a mirror and be really honest with ourselves and how we're showing up for ourselves in our practice or in our role in our work, so that we can then be a better leader for the people around us. And that sometimes means looking at things like our time, even though especially those in this role, it's numbers driven and it's data and there's, certain sales numbers, like all of those things. And at the same time, so they hear about time management and we all hear about time management, how to be more efficient. But sometimes we have to go, okay, we've heard about it, but are we actually doing it? Right? Like, are we actually, if we are struggling with time and being efficient and getting the things done? And I hear this all the time when I'm working with leaders, because you oftentimes are, when you're elevating in leadership roles, whether it's in your own business and you're growing a team or you work for an organization, you've got your own stuff to do. And so it's like this juggling act of how do I get my own stuff done while also be available to answer questions. One of the things that came up in our session was, I said, what are the things that really you struggle with time? And someone said it was like the drive-bys. They're like, hey, you have a minute? And oh my goodness, I hear this from clients all the time. My leaders who, people are, messaging them or pinging them, or, if they're in the office, they're stopping by and saying, hey, do you have a minute? And your time just feels like it's getting like sucked away. And so we have to come at it from a few different approaches. And one of the tools, some of the tools that we talked about in that session I led was around being really honest with ourselves about how we're using our time. So I even encouraged things like a time log where you actually track how you're using your time. Because if you tell me that you're really struggling with time, but we don't know how you're using your time, it's really hard for us to come up with a plan. So actually I encouraged the audience there to actually do a time log where it's like not what you think you did, or if somebody was asking you what you did and you didn't want to tell them what you were actually doing with your time. No, what you actually did, not what you would like pretend like you did. So, you got in at this time, you grabbed a cup of coffee, you stopped and talked to like Sally or Joe in the hallway, you started checking your email, then you started this project, but then you had to go to this other thing. Like, that's what we mean by a time log, so that you can actually know how you're using your time. We also talked about time blocking, so blocking things on your calendar. We talked about kind of the science behind trying to group things together, like-minded things together. So, for example, if you're going to have, in your business, like revenue generating activities like outreach or prospecting, or you're going to be doing like sales types activities, versus if you're doing things maybe like creative things like marketing or projects or things like that. Trying to group those things together so that you can be more efficient. Also, things like meetings. So, this can be really hard if other people are scheduling meetings, but to the extent you can, it's trying to group meetings together so that you don't have, like, one of the examples I used was if you leave like a half hour, time block in between calls or meetings and you think you're going to get something done, the reality of what usually happens is your call runs or your meeting runs a few minutes over, and then you get up and you run to the restroom, and then you grab a coffee, and then you talk to someone in the hallway, you sit down, you start, working on this thing that you blocked the time for that hour. You get a couple minutes into it, and then you realize, like, oh shoot, now I need to start prepping for my next meeting, and it's like almost like a wasted hour. So how could you actually have back-to-back meetings and then do all of those other things at another time? So that was another thing we talked about. And then obviously we talked about, from a leadership perspective, like delegating and building out your team. And as much as you feel like you are the only one that can do things, you aren't. Other people can do things, sometimes even better than us. But the other thing that came up in this section then was boundaries, because people kept saying, like, all this sounds great, but what if somebody is constantly stopping by or saying, I need help? And as in a leadership role, particularly, you want to help. You feel like it's your responsibility in your job to be there to answer questions and to support them. And yes, and also, it's also your job to set the example for expectations, for use of time, to empower them to solve things. And so I was saying that sometimes if we continue to like spoon feed people, and every single time they come to us, we give them the answer or we drop everything we're doing, we are teaching them how to treat us. And it's amazing to feel like needed and wanted and like you're a wealth of information. But if you're constantly getting interrupted during the day, it's really hard for you to stay in your zone of genius. And if you're the leader or the visionary in your business and you're a leadership role, or in your company, and you need to set strategy or budget, whatever it is, and you're constantly being pulled away, it's really hard to show up in that leadership role. And so it's about setting clear boundaries for yourself and for the people you're leading, for the people on your team. And boundaries don't have to be a negative thing. This doesn't mean that you're standoffish. This doesn't mean that you're not willing to help or to answer questions or support people through things. What it means is that you are really stepping and owning in your role as a leader, the role in your life, as how you use your time. And you're also then setting the example and giving permission for the other people to do the same. And we talked about what this group is, they're leading these people, and these people are also going to struggle with their time and how to manage all of these things. And so if they can be the example and they can effectively and in a healthy way set boundaries on their time and their communication with people, then they are teaching and giving permission to these other people to do that as well, so that they don't find themselves overwhelmed and burned out. And so first, it's just getting clear on your own frame of reference when it comes to boundaries, and that it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It doesn't have to be they're going to think I'm not available. Instead, it's like, how can this be a really positive thing? And then it's really getting clear on, like, what do those boundaries look like for you? And so sometimes when we have that reframe and we look at it a little bit more open, like, I could see the shift in the people who were there. They're like, yeah, that's really true. Is by me setting more boundaries, I'm actually going to be more helpful for them, and I'm actually going to be more in tune and attentive versus, they say, like, do you have a minute? And you're still kind of focused on the thing you're doing. And then you're kind of answering them like you're not really full all in for either thing. Right. And that's not doing them a service or yourself. And so starting with that reframe and then getting clear on, like, what do you want those boundaries to look like, and having open communication. So if you have people on your team or things like that, it's having clear communication of what your boundaries on your time or the way that you're going to interact and communicate, the way you're going to meet, and the why behind it. So that it's really good to do that at the start of a relationship. So the start of, you leading this person or this team or things like that is to be like, hey, this is how we're going to meet once a week. If you need support in between that, these are the ways that you can reach me. These are these are the hours. I either have open office hours, or if you really need something, send me a message. You can stop by if it's urgent. If it's not, give them another thing that came up with somebody brought up was like one thing they do is they give people other resources. So they're like, they almost have like a tree, and like, if you need help with this thing, go here. If you need help with this, go to this person. And if none of that works, come to me. So giving them options and resources, but then just having clear communication and explaining why and telling them the reason that I do this is so that, I can really focus on the things I'm working on and also be fully present for you when you need me. Absolutely. If there's like an emergency and you need me, if it can wait, these are my office hours, or if it can wait, can I get back to you at 2:00? Like, it's okay to say that. And they might say like, oh yeah, it's not urgent. It came up for them. And so setting those expectations and also being willing to change those and flex those and know that, if whatever you're doing right now isn't working, you can change that. So if you're like, oh, I really do need to start setting more boundaries on my time and the way we communicate, and you didn't do it at the beginning, that's okay, because you can do it at any point. Like, have a recalibration meeting, reestablishing roles and responsibilities, whatever you want to call it, and say like, hey, something I've noticed is sometimes I'm not fully present when you ask me questions, or I'm noticing that I'm not using my time as efficiently. However you want to word it, I'm noticing that there's opportunities for us to communicate more effectively and just kind of reset what those expectations are. And also for them, like, how do they like to be communicated with? Are you the one, kind of creeping on other people's boundaries that they've set? Because oftentimes I find when there's frustration or, on our time or in those relationships, because there's just not clear communication of what the expectation is. If we don't set that with them, then how are they supposed to know? And so there was you could see so many insights coming up as we were doing this section around these boundaries and how it's actually okay to have those. And when we have those conversations, we get more efficient, we feel more energized, we're more in our zone of genius, and we give permission to the other people looking to us or that we're leading to also set those boundaries and really start to kind of make those changes around that. And this is, we were talking about this from a professional perspective, but obviously we can bring this in our personal lives too, as our own boundaries. We can have boundaries for a bunch of things, our boundaries with our phones, our boundaries with, even in our family. Like, think about if you have clear communication with your kids or your spouse around, hey, when I'm working out, like, my boundary is, unless you absolutely need me, it's my time, or whatever that might look like for you, like boundaries around, sleep or whatever that is. But it's the clear communication, and it's being okay with it. It's okay to have those boundaries, because when they're unspoken, that's when there's usually issues, right? So if you're in your head, you're like, why would they think it's okay to keep interrupting me or keep stopping by? And then you get frustrated, maybe you snap on them or whatever it is, but they don't know that that's a boundary for you. Like, hey, when I'm like head down focused on this, I don't want to be interrupted. Then how can we fault them and how can we blame them? So what do you need to start putting in place, and how can you start thinking of boundaries? I know, at the end of the session, so we did this piece on, started with time, and then we talked about kind of this effective leadership framework and all these different things we can do. And at the end, when I said, what's something you're really going to work on, multiple people said the boundaries, and then we kind of pushed. And so for you, I want you to think about this first part of like, do you have boundaries? What do those look like for you? And if you were to implement more of those, how would that help you in your productivity, your team's productivity, your family's life? And what's that thing? So someone's like, oh, I'm going to start doing more boundaries. Well, as a coach, I'm going to say, okay, well, what does that look like? So you need to get really clear on like, what does that mean? What does it mean to set more boundaries? And what's the first step that you need to take? So somebody said he was going to do that. And I was like, okay, so what does that look like? He's like, I'm going to have more boundaries around, my work time when people stop by, I'm going to do things like, and he had kind of specific examples. I'm going to, have more communication with them on when they should, stop by. I'm going to ask them if it's urgent or if it's something that can wait. And so we kind of had these like tiers, and then you can kind of check in with yourself and go, okay, how do those things feel? And maybe even open up the conversation for other people to say like, hey, what type of boundaries do you have? You don't have to use that word if you don't want. Sometimes we just use it for ourselves, but it's when we don't have those set or we're not clear on them is often when we get frustrated about our time. So I want you to think about this is where could you benefit from having more boundaries on your time, on expectations, and have you even communicated that to people? And I'm really excited to, stay connected to some of the people who are in this session and be able to follow up with them and say, hey, how has that been going for you? So I want you to think about this and where would it benefit for you to have more boundaries? And if this is a topic that is of interest to you, if it's something that you feel like you personally need to work on to help you show up more efficiently in your business or in your leadership role within your organization, send me a message. We talk a lot about this when I'm working with one-on-one executive and high performance coaching clients on boundaries on time, communication on how to actually communicate those things, how to give coaching and feedback to the people on your teams. These are topics that come up a lot in our one-on-one coaching sessions, as well as if this is a topic that you want to look at bringing to your team or organization. I have kind of off-the-shelf topics that we do, as well as custom content that I create. This was one of a custom session that I created for this organization to help these people in their role and really use specific examples. So feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is always in the show notes for the podcast, and we can talk more about implementing boundaries for you or your team.